All right, so I'm going to go ahead and record these three plant videos that you have on my own. So sorry, you're stuck with me. Um, so today's video is an introduction to plants. We're going to go over some really basic characteristics, and I really mean basic characteristics of plants. And then we're going to take a look at the diversity of plants, different groups. And it's going to be based on some pretty basic characteristics. You're going to get a lot of detail at once. So hopefully it's not too overwhelming. So here we go. So I really hope that all of you understand these characteristics of plants already. They are eukaryotic, meaning they have a nucleus. They have cell walls that have cellulose in them, as we've talked about. And finally, they are autotrophic. They can make their own food by harnessing energy from the environment. And they do this through a process called photosynthesis, which once again, hopefully is reviewed for you guys. But just in case it's not, that is when a plant takes carbon dioxide from the environment and reacts it with water using energy from the sun. And it stores that energy into sugars. And a waste product of this is oxygen. Although it's their waste, we need that oxygen to live. So we're very grateful that that is their waste product. And it makes these really simple sugars called glucose, C6H12O6. But if the plant doesn't use that sugar immediately, it can be converted into a more complex sugar, which we call starch. Remember way back when we were talking about how you have monomers and polymers. Monomers are small things that can be put together to make a bigger molecule. Polysaccharides, monosaccharides is specific to sugars. Well, glucose is a monosaccharide. You can put a bunch of those together to make starches. That's like what's in like beans are starchy. It was glucose that was once put together via photosynthesis, and then it was all stored up in that bean. Now plants have, not all plants, but most plants have something called vascular tissue. You've probably heard the word vascular before when referring to your cardiovascular system, which is your heart and your blood vessels. And it's called that because it transports blood throughout your body. Now, plants don't have blood. They have water, but their vascular system is the water and the food and the different types of cells that water and food transports through. So the cells that actually transport water, which we'll go in a lot more detail in a future video, are called xylem, not xylem, xylem. It's kind of like with a Z. And that transports water up the plant from the roots all the way to the top. Now, the phloem are the cells that take food that's usually made at the top of the plant and transport it down towards the roots. So you have xylem flowing up, phloem flowing down, water goes up the xylem, food goes down the phloem. Those are the two types of tissues that transport stuff through the plant. Now we're going to get into the actual classification of plants. Now these are the different groups of plants. You'll see there's some really basic differences between them. I'm going to go in slightly more detail. So here we go. Now, we've talked about green algae already. In fact, when we did our protists video, I talked about, well, green algae have been previously regarded as protists. Now more people kind of think they're plants. There is still some disagreement as to how they should be classified, but pretty much I think most scientists that are into classification will argue that they are plants, or at the very least that plants evolved from green algae. Therefore, green algae is a common ancestor of all plants. So green algae do not use seeds. They are mostly aquatic. There are some green algae that are able to live on land, mainly if they're interacting with fungus in a lichen. Now, they are mostly unicellular. There are some multicellular algae. They can reproduce both sexually and asexually. We might not go into detail on algae, but we're going to have a whole video talking about how plants reproduce. That's your next video, actually. And then they do not have vascular tissue, so they don't need to transport water and food around this whole body of an organism. It's partially because they're so small. When you're only one cell, like most algae, you don't need this big intricate system to transport food and water throughout your body because you are just one cell. And it's not that hard to move from one side of the cell to the other. And they can actually take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis from the water. Your next group are the bryophytes. Okay, now I want you to keep referencing the chart that is on your notes as we go through this. You can sort of see the evolutionary history of plants. So Bryophytes are still relatively primitive. The most common, at least around here, example of bryophyte are mosses. Now, mosses use spores instead of seeds, and they do not have vascular tissue, so they can't move water or food throughout their bodies. So this actually causes them to stay pretty small because since they do not have the ability to use multiple cells that solely transport water and transport water to different areas, they can't grow very big. Because if water can only go from cell to cell, and it's kind of a slow process, if you have a big organism and you need water to move to the top or something, it's very difficult to do without that vascular tissue. They use osmosis for pretty much everything, whether taking nutrients from the environment. They actually also rely on water for spreading spores, and they usually only grow about as tall as the level of water in their environment. They're not underwater, but like they only grow about as tall as where water is somewhat consistently there in the environment because they rely on water because they need to take everything into their body through osmosis. So some examples of bryophytes are mosses. You also have liverworts and hornworts. There's some pictures of all those down there. So getting a little more advanced, if you don't mind me going back to the chart in a second, you have every type of plant now that has vascular tissue called the tracheophyte. So if you look back at the chart, we've talked about green algae, we talked about bryophytes. Now those other three groups are called the tracheophytes because they have vascular tissue. So you got ferns, conifers, and flowering plants. So let's go back to where we were. As I said, ferns, conifers, and flowering plants all fall into this category. So that first group, the ferns, they have vascular tissue, but they do not have seeds. They still use spores. And actually, you'll notice a lot of these seedless vascular plants have spores that gather on the bottom of their leaves. And the bottom of that leaf where that gathers is called a frond. And some examples of seedless vascular plants are ferns, club mosses, and horsetails, as shown there. Now, our next category, so we've gone from you have your green algae, then you have your bryophytes, then you have your pteridophytes, which are the seedless vascular plants. You now have these two groups over here, and those two groups have the seeds, and they're also vascular plants. Now, within that group of plants that has seeds, you could actually split those into two groups. You can call them the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. And the gymnosperms are the ones that do not have flowers. Angiosperms are the ones that do have flowers. Now, while we're on the subject of seeds, let's take a look at what a seed actually has in it. It usually has, not usually, it always has an embryo in it. Surrounding that embryo is the food supply for that seed. And on the outside of that, you have what's called a seed coat. Now, gymnosperm, if you do the Latin translation, if you will, means naked seed. The reason it's called a naked seed is the key difference between gymnosperms and angiosperms, as we said, are gymnosperms don't have flowers, angiosperms do have flowers. Now, flowers generally, once the ovary gets fertilized and a seed starts to grow, a fruit will grow around the seed. That's not the case in gymnosperms. Gymnosperms don't make fruit. They just have seeds that grow at the base of the scales of a cone. So if you think of a cone, like of any sort of pine tree you've seen before, they have those flat little scales coming out. Well, at the base of that is where seeds are located as they grow. And now gymnosperms, they use pollen, and the pollen doesn't get carried by anything in particular. It is transported by the wind. Since you can't predict where wind's going to go, and there's only a small chance that one pollen grain coming from one tree is going to end up directly at another tree, the gymnosperms play a little bit of a numbers game. So they produce a whole lot of pollen because only a certain amount is going to actually make it there. So in order for a gymnosperm to actually reproduce, it needs to produce a lot of pollen. So if you are allergic to pollen, like me, you could thank the gymnosperms because most of the pollen in the air is probably from gymnosperms. And some examples of those are any conifer, cycads, which are the ones that are in middle on the right on your slide there. They kind of look like palm trees. And ginkgo trees, and then there's also neophytes, which I will show you in class, because one of my favorite plants is a neophyte. But anyway, we'll get to that in a bit. And then finally, the last group, and maybe the most charismatic group of the plants, are the angiosperms. Angiosperms are any plant that has a flower. And in that flower, you have an ovary, or at the bottom you have an ovary, and at the top normally pollen is produced. Pollen is actually the male, actually carries the sperm. So once the ovary gets fertilized, it starts to produce a seed, and as the seed matures, fruit actually develops around that seed. Now, any flowering plant depends on some sort of animal, whether it be that hummingbird there, an insect, something like that. It depends on an animal to spread the pollen. That's normally why you see such cool shapes and stuff of the flower, or bright colors, because it attracts animals to go to that flower. Normally they go there for nectar or something. And as they visit, pollen comes off onto the animal, and when they go and visit another flower, the pollen goes off and fertilizes the other flower. Pretty cool stuff. But you might be sad to know that we actually split angiosperms into two separate groups. And it's depending on a particular trait called the cotyledon. Now, a cotyledon is also known as a seed leaf, because within the seed, if you don't mind me flipping all the way back to that picture of the seed, you'll notice there's one little leaf surrounding the embryo. So in the seeds and angiosperms, there's either one leaf or there's two leaves. And normally when a seed germinates or it starts to sprout, you see that one leaf or two leaves coming out. The ones with one leaf are called a monocot. The ones with two leaves are the dicot. Now this particular aspect, I'm not going to be testing you on. But there are going to be some labs and things like that you are going to have to identify whether the flower is a monocot or a dicot. So I've included this handy chart for you on your notes. So I know the amount of plant classification we just did is a little overwhelming. So I'd recommend you take a look at the most basic differences between all those groups we just talked about. Just like when you had to sort of memorize your different kingdoms of life. Try to sort through and find only the most basic differences to help you sort of pick out what makes each of those groups differ. That's my big advice before you take your checkpoint. Okay? And that chart that I gave you does actually do this for you pretty well. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.